I think you're muted, by the way.
All right, thanks. Let me start over. So a couple things that I did say. I posted the link, the YouTube for class number 1. That's in the announcements section on Canvas. And the other is just a reminder that next week we start with the cohorts. I will publish that later today. I now have a final list of who the students are, so that enabled me to pull the cohorts and the project teams together. I will put that on Canvas no later than tomorrow morning, hopefully today. All right, so with that, let's get started and we'll jump right into the material for this. Today, we're going to talk about, at a high level, what does globalization mean in the context of international business? All right, it's really kind of setting the foundation for the things that we're going to talk about through this semester. The basic learning objectives that we want to accomplish is certainly understand what globalization means. Each of us might have a slightly different variant of what that meaning is, but we'll at least get a solid foundation that we can all somewhat agree on. What are the main drivers? What drives, and when we talk about globalization, what's really driving it? All right. And how does the global economy change? I mean, over time, what happens, and how do we within the business environment kind of navigate all those changes? All right. What are some of the elements and the impacts of globalization on our business and our structure, on our strategy? And what are those opportunities and challenges that we need to be aware of in order to appropriately capitalize and benefit from the opportunities and address the challenges to better manage how we maximize the profits of our business? We'll talk a little bit about this in the context from an opening perspective of different companies. And I'll spend a fair amount of time on Apple, the Apple company. We'll touch also, and I'll probably gloss quickly over Boeing, General Motors, and we'll get into a little bit from a country perspective. Understand that Apple, and if you could, just type into chat, for all of you on this call, type into chat whether you're an Apple user or whether you use something else. Just like to get a basic perspective of what your interests are from a from a smartphone perspective primarily. So it's the vast majority are Apple. There's one that fits me. I'm a Samsung. An Android. That's my preference, but I think 98% of the class is Apple. So that's interesting, and it seems to be pretty similar throughout all of my classes so far. And I like to do that little quick survey just to kind of get a perspective. You know, companies like Apple, they're reaching out to you, your demographic, and any company does. But over time, they believe if you like it now, if you're an Apple supporter today, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, you'll continue the same way. But how does Apple operate in a global environment to meet the demand that they are looking and seeing? The vast majority of iPhones are produced in China at a company called Foxconn. There's actually two, and you see in the opening slide here, Foxconn and Pegatron are the two main companies that produce Apple iPhones. All right. Better than half of the production is in the China factory at Foxconn. Now, Foxconn is a global corporation, a contract manufacturer, and they work with many companies. They're in a CMO, contract manufacturing organization. They are one of the leaders and clearly focused on consumer electronics. They have facilities in other parts of the world, Brazil, India, and other places as well. That's going to be an important point that we'll raise in the next few slides here as we address how do companies like Apple or General Motors or others who have been heavily focused on certain factories in China, how do they adapt going forward in the post-pandemic, post-COVID-19 environment? You can see from a few graphics and slides that I have here that the components that go into an iPhone are varied. They come from all over the world. The storage devices come from Japan, maybe primarily Toshiba. The camera itself might come from Sony. All right, displays from Asahi in Japan. The random access memory, certain memory from Samsung. The processor, okay, and this is going to be interesting. So processors have come from a number of sources. Samsung has provided some. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corp, TSMC in Taiwan has provided some. Intel has provided some. Apple is actually transitioning many of its iPhones to its own processors now. So that's another transition. You see, the various RF devices coming from Qualcomm in China. You see Wi-Fi modules from USI. This graphic gives you a perspective that the iPhone that you hold and that you utilize has components that come from different parts of the world, ultimately to Foxconn, where it is final assembled, and then delivered on to its customer. It also works, another large part of its production is done at another company in China, another key contract manufacturer called Pegatron. When Apple started and Steve Jobs kicked it off, he really look at it as an American-centric company. He built, his reputation for the Macintosh, the initial Macintosh computer, based on Made in America. Over time, he has shifted. The company has shifted. Now, Steve Jobs is no longer with us, but other leaders of Apple have followed suit and have become an international organization with much of its vast majority of its production in offshore environments. Okay. Now, 90% of the products of the iPhone are produced in various global locations. I've touched on some of those already. You get to see just the expansive nature of what a supply chain means to a company. And we're going to talk a lot about this through this semester in terms of what we refer to as the value delivery network. The value delivery network is everything from the component suppliers leading into the manufacturing environment, the production environment, and then ultimately being produced within our operation and then delivered and distributed and communicated to our customers, post-production. Some of the glass on the displays or on the front of the iPhone comes from US-based Corning. Okay? When they look at flexible glass, they look at bending glass, they look at durability of the glass. They go to key companies out there, such as Corning and others, to produce the components. Each of their products that they put into the iPhone is in the context of their supply network, best in class. They may do much of the design, the marketing and software engineering in the United States, but much of the components and the hardware comes from different parts of the world. This is just a graphic intended only to show you the complexity of how these parts must be sourced, designed first, and then sourced from various peoples and ultimately fit within the confines of a relatively compact consumer electronic product. And a key element of this is to understand how products like the iPhone, for example, while there are many components, there's also associated costs to that for those who may be an accounting major. And we're looking at the basic bills of material, BOM, for some of the Apple products here. Okay. And then the next slide here, this is a real eye chart here. Sorry about that. You can certainly look at it and expand it on your own computer, but this is the typical bill of material of what goes into the iPhone 10. Okay, as you can see, the bill of material costs about $370 US. Now, I don't know how many of you have an iPhone 10, but I can assure you, you've paid significantly more than $370. So beyond this, there'll be some additional costs, sales and marketing costs, distribution costs, and so on that add to it. But ultimately, based on the components that you see, the sales and marketing, any other distribution related costs, marketing costs, sales costs, sometimes tariffs and or taxes, any other additional costs ultimately drives the basic cost structure, which then drives part of the pricing. Not solely, it's not necessarily a cost up pricing, but Apple has the ability to command a very high price for a relatively comparable product because they have such a strong, high quality brand image. I draw your attention to a couple of areas here on this eye chart bill of material that they purchase most of their displays come from a competitor, quite frankly. Samsung. Samsung provides the displays in many of the iPhones. And also, as you can see here, as I mentioned a moment ago, their processors are now making their own processors in-house, which has been a huge change in strategy. Part of that is to drive down the cost of the components, a very significant cost of their cost of materials, their cost of goods sold. You can see they have a number of suppliers, the costs associated. We go through this kind of reverse engineering. We buy some components. We all do it. I've did it in my former life, and buy my competitors' products, take it apart, figure out how much it costs, and then I can get a sense of how I compete with them on a price level. So let me ask you this question. And those of you who have read this material ahead or are looking at it, you know the answer to it, but why aren't iPhones built in the United States? I'd love to have this conversation, and any of you who are comfortable.
Labor costs.
Okay, labor cost is one. Okay, that would certainly drive the component cost, but keep going. What is it that, just think through the volume of iPhones, just on this call, on this class right here. All right, what do we have? Roughly 45 students.
Isn't there more available labor as well?
That's the key, Johan. Okay. It really is, think of it this way. Okay. Who can build the greatest number of iPhones in the shortest period of time? The demand, just on this call right here. Let's say 98% of you are using an iPhone. 2% of us, me and the other, I'm in the other 2%. All right. But the demand, okay, just from the volume that needs to be produced, where else, okay, can we have manufacturing scale, speed, efficiency, not just of the final production of an iPhone, but of all the supplying components that come into it. All right. Everything that changes at the last minute. All right. Sometimes demand goes up, sometimes demand goes down. Who can respond appropriately and quickly and efficiently to those fluctuations in demand? Product components might change. At one point, iPhone had a plastic screen on it. The engineers and the leadership at Apple said, no more. We want the best glass, okay? Something that doesn't shatter, et cetera, a variety of features to that glass. So they made some product changes. Who can respond to those product changes quickly? Yes, there's lower cost of labor. Yes, that is an important element to it. But it's not just the labor cost, it's the scalability of the operations of both the final production as well as all the suppliers has to scale up or scale down based on demand fluctuations. And think of this. At Foxconn, there are 230,000 workers. Now, the basic question here, why isn't it in the United States? Pick an area anywhere that you can think of in the United States, anywhere. And tell me where you're going to get 230,000 workers every day. Now, yeah, we have a lot of population in New York City or Chicago, but not to that degree. Think of this. In addition to 230,000 workers, they have 8,700 engineering management working to make sure that the product and the processes flow appropriately and the product meets the same levels of quality, and they quickly and efficiently build those products so that there are no either technical problems or financial problems. They recruited those 8,700 engineers, all right, in 2 weeks. They hired 8,700 engineers in 2 weeks. If we were to do that in the United States, it would be somewhere near a year before you can get that quantity. And the only way you're going to get that quantity in the United States is to take them away from other companies. And then the other companies struggle. An area that I know quite well because I've set up operations. And later this semester, we're going to have one of my former bosses, Gary Brewer, and he and I will probably talk about the fact that we set up operations in China in a place called Suzhou, China. And we purchased another company as well. As part of setting up an operation in China, one of the requirements is you provide them housing. All right. And at least give them the option for housing. Company owned, company provided housing. Dorms, barracks, nothing fancy, but they have the ability to live at the company site. Foxconn employees work extensively. Okay. It's not an easy job. It's not well paid by standards of other countries. All right. They get 1 day off a week. They're working 10 to 12-hour days. Relatively low pay from the standpoint of, the kind of work that they're doing for the amount of time that they're putting into it. Okay. These are the reasons. The supply chain is in relatively short distance from Foxconn factory. So not only does Foxconn employ over 200,000 people, but the suppliers have another, X number thousand people that provide the components to them. A significant network of employment. And that is one of the reasons. There aren't a lot of places in the world that you can easily do this. India may be one, okay? And India is looking to compete. There are efforts underway by Foxconn, and we'll get into the next couple of slides, to look and to diversify to different parts of the world. Part of this semester, I'm going to challenge you a little bit about ethical discussions. All right. And it's important because we want to be able to understand, the ethical elements of making some of the decisions that we face when conducting business. What I just described to you, okay, is a concern that many companies have, not just with Apple, but they have the same concerns with maybe Nike or other key suppliers of products that we know quite well. Oftentimes, the employees are in poor working conditions, relatively low pay, long hours, sometimes don't even have the option to work overtime. They are told it's mandatory. Sometimes the safety conditions are not the best. Oftentimes there are conflicting goals between lowering those costs and providing better working conditions and or benefits. These are the trade-offs. And in the context of this discussion, I want you to begin to think about how, if I were running this company, if you were running this company, what would your decision be on each of these elements? We can certainly provide, and I'm not taking a case one way, taking a position one way or the other here. I just want to present you the ethical dialogue that we have in this context. We can provide better working conditions. We can provide better benefits. We can provide higher pay. With that comes a cost. We can transition out of China to other parts of the world. With that comes a cost. So one of the questions I ask, and this is kind of a rhetorical question, you don't have to answer it for me, but think about it. In order to achieve those, are you as the consumer, and 98% of you have an iPhone, are you as the consumer prepared to pay $200, $300 more for that very device? That's the ethical dilemma. Okay? Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. If you aren't, then we have to look at how do we keep the costs in line and the profit margins appropriate. Okay. These are the challenges that we're going to continuously discuss throughout the semester. The trade-offs between better working conditions, lower price. Okay. All of those elements. Yes, I would say ideally we have great working conditions. We have well pay. We have safe conditions. We have reasonable hours and all of those. And we have profits with a purpose. Okay. I'll use that phrase often.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, but is another part of it as well, like Apple moves to have better working conditions and higher pay for their workers at different factories in different countries, or maybe even in the United States. And then suddenly Samsung sees, oh look, they've raised their price by 30%, and then Samsung becomes an even bigger competitor with Apple, right? Is that also a factor? Because
I
I'm
think,
assuming,
I think so. I think, how would you respond if you were Samsung and you saw Apple increase its price for a comparable unit? Now,
um,
go ahead.
well, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, come back to the point earlier. Apple has been successful at charging a high price because in the mind of the consumer, the value is there. At what point psychologically, we get into this discussion a lot in my consumer behavior classes. At what point do we exceed what the customers perceive as the right value point? And at some point, if we raise the price, so let's just throw numbers out there. Okay, today maybe an iPhone 10, I forget exactly, what's that, around $1,200?
I think so.
Would you buy it if it was $2,000?
No, I would buy a car.
Would you buy it at $1,500?
Yeah,
Would you buy it at $1,300? So
yeah, it's
what's the point that you say no? And,
Here-
and when I say you, I mean you collectively, not you individually. At what point does the market say enough? Okay, I'm not going to pay any more for it, and I'm going to switch over to Samsung, even though it's painful. Those are the things those are the trade-offs. Okay? And it's a great question. Different companies are going to look at this differently. In that context, I think, if Samsung were watching this, one of the things they might consider is I'll keep my price low and have people come over to me.
Mhm.
They could follow suit and get a little bit more profit and stay underneath the the uh, uh, the point that Apple is at, and that may be a viable strategy for them as well. They also may do that in different regions. I may choose to be more competitive on price in the United States and less competitive on price in Germany.
Now, if hypothetically Apple leaves manufacturing, leaves China, do they lose access to some of these components that they're using?
Yeah, and that they could, and quite frankly, China during COVID really was intelligent in how they approached companies like Apple. They offered them incentives to stay. And we will get into that a little bit. And I'm actually next few slides going to say, Foxconn is still looking at other countries. They have to now.
Mhm.
But there are financial incentives that different countries are now looking at. India is looking to attract the business. China is looking to retain the business. So we see competition between countries for Foxconn and others' business.
Okay.
It's one of the challenges that we're now looking at. Okay. Good questions. I love this. All right. This just gets into a little bit more of what I've already talked about, so no need to restate this. So this is kind of some headlines that I just threw in here to give you a sense. All right. Foxconn and Pegatron both looking now to consider growth into Mexico, diversifying from China a little bit. And now this leads to, will they have more of rather than a full global strategy to supply everybody from a single factory, will they now use more regional based factories? Can I supply North America from Mexico? More Mexico. Looking at India, all right? Expanding and building certain products, iPhone 11 XR in India. Now, they will most likely supply India from India. Maintaining presence in China for the Chinese market, and expanding its operations and presence in India for the growth of the Indian market. Many companies are also looking at supplying, and this is not just related to iPhones, but looking at supplying from Vietnam. Okay. Now, Vietnam doesn't have the scalability that I mentioned earlier, but they certainly have some of the other elements relatively close to Southeast Asia, markets, relatively inexpensive transportation between the other countries that they can source from, relatively low labor costs, and the incentives from the government providing them the financial incentives to come to Vietnam. So Apple's built a significant network, value delivery network, from supplier to factory to customer. Right? They have worked with contract manufacturers such as Foxconn, such as Pegatron, and developed that network in order to meet the fluctuations in demand. They've formed multiple partnerships in order to enable that and maintain a solid, quality-based supply chain. Okay. Now, I'll gloss over this one relatively quickly because it's much the same in terms of the complexities of the supply chain network. Boeing. Now, Boeing's been in the news for a lot of the wrong reasons of late. That said, some of the challenges they face, this is their bill of material, right? A little different than the iPhone that I put up there earlier, right? Significantly more complex, significantly more challenging in terms of the engineering, design, sourcing, and ultimately final assembly. Obviously, this is not intended for you to read all 184 different components here, but you get a sense just looking at the kind of the cross-section design here, how complicated it is to obtain parts for the Boeing 737. Their suppliers, look at them. Non-US suppliers 50 years ago, 5% of their portfolio, of their bill of material. Today, 2/3 of it come from non-US based suppliers. It has evolved over time and is an incredibly more complex and global company. This just kind of outlines, what you saw in that graphic. Okay, we don't need to go specifically here, but just like the iPhone, an airplane gets its components from all over the world, and they have to conform to the engineering design standards, the quality standards, all of the above. All right. They went from pretty much when 5% of its suppliers were non-US, they were a vertically integrated company. Today, 2/3 their products come from outside the US. They're an outsourcing, offshoring model. They do that because many of their customers are offshore as well. They're not just US based airplanes. They have shared risk. They work with their suppliers in the design and the development. This is critical when you are building a solid value delivery network. I can't just sit in my office, and I'll say this from my own perspective. I had a fairly large corporation that I managed and teams all over the world. There was no way I could sit in the United States, in Rochester, New York, or wherever my offices were, Dayton, Ohio, you name it, and make all the decisions there and just pick up the phone or send out an email and say, do this. we had to work with our suppliers. We had to be on site. We had to work with them to design the products in a manner that was consistent with our quality and the standards that we set. It was an interactive discussion. It was one where they provided input, we provided input, and ultimately we co-designed the products. That's what Boeing is doing very well. That's what Apple's doing very well. All right.
I have a question.
Yep.
So, did they change? Oh, well, so I just, sorry, I'm a little, so it's cheaper for them to outsource, and also it's a strategy that they're using to relate to their um, non-US customers for Boeing.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily going to say it's cheaper to outsource in all cases, but sometimes you don't have necessarily the core competency to do everything yourself. So you need to work with other companies.
Okay.
Other companies have better expertise in seat design, okay, or glass for the windshield. And they don't necessarily have all of that expertise inside. They know what they need, but other companies, Corning is better at glass, okay? Johnson Controls is better at seat design, things like that.
Okay.
So they need to, and ultimately, if done properly, you probably do hold down the cost to a more manageable level.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep. Oh, so kind of the last point there, I guess, is the flip side of that. When you outsource, and when they were vertically integrated, they did have all this expertise internally. Okay, they couldn't meet the volume, they couldn't do some other things, but the expertise was there. When you do outsource, over time, you might lose some of that expertise and become more dependent on suppliers. All right. We'll this semester we're going to touch on, and I encourage you at some point, read up on Michael Porter. Michael Porter's 5 Forces. And he talks a lot about, he's a Harvard professor, but supplier power or customer power. You know, the balance and the alignment of who has most power in a relationship. If somebody has all the expertise, if the wing designer has all the expertise and Boeing doesn't, who has more power in that relationship? And by power, we mean who can command a higher price, who can command better terms and conditions. Those are things that ultimately have to be factored into forming relationships with other companies. All right. So, as I said, their strategy was to outsource to the best in class to meet the demands. Now, they've certainly had some challenges, and over time, 737 MAX, you know, really, I think just a month ago, has rebounded or begun to get back in the air after some tragedies. And those tragedies were truly tragedies where mistakes were made. And it was proven that some of the individuals inside of Boeing were aware or cognizant of what was taking place. That software glitches occurred, and as a result, lives were lost. All right. Their stock took a tumble. They had to work through corrective action to figure out how to fix it. The FAA certainly grounded them, and ultimately they began to work together with their suppliers to revisit where the problems were, and then regain, the integrity that they once had, and regain the confidence from their customers. Okay, so with that, I'm going to say very briefly, just touch a little bit on General Motors in China. How did they enter China? They formed a joint venture, SAIC and General Motors. They began to ultimately work in different parts of China and set up various plants, for components as well as final assembly. And by operating in that environment, they are able to supply the Chinese market. Now, I'll draw your attention to the last bullet point here, Wuhan, China Motor City. 4 different Chevrolet and Buick models come out of there. Why do we know Wuhan? Wuhan is where COVID, some believe, or many believe, Wuhan is where it started. Now, as a result, there was a lot of lockdown on the city, which put disruptions into supply chain of various companies. General Motors just being one of them. Many companies getting parts from certain suppliers in different cities in China as we went through the COVID-19 lockdowns caused disruptions in those chains. When we talk about this, we talk about how do we as companies manage these challenges. One way we manage it is to keep some level of inventory in stock, okay, so that we have a buffer stock in order to hold us through until we can either find another supplier or supply can be scaled back up. Ultimately, these are some of the challenges that we are addressing when we have disruptions in the supply chain. COVID-19 created disruptions in the supply chain, as they have similar. SARS did the same thing years ago. The 2008 financial crisis created some disruptions in supply chain. So these are geopolitical, social events and healthcare events that occur at any given time, and we need to be prepared to be able to sustain our business through those times. All right, I got ahead of myself. Contingency planning, okay? That's really what we're saying here. So they looked at other suppliers, other partners. They staggered some of their production to other factories, and ultimately were able to kind of sustain itself through that period. General Motors also, working with their joint ventures, were able to build products without necessarily having to have the same volume of employees. In other words, they created robotic plants. And as you can see here in Jinqiao, the robotic manufacturing of some of its products, 567 robots building the vehicles in that particular facility. Oftentimes, the strategies that companies utilize, in this particular case, we're talking about GM in China, they do so to be close to the customer. They see a growth in China. They want to build and work with the companies to be somewhat local, to be a domestic Chinese company. We think of General Motors as Detroit, United States, but it is a global company. And being multi-domestic in that regard, enables them to gain a foothold in China in a significant growth market, and to be able to capitalize on that by being somewhat local. As you can see, in 2018, GM sold 3.7 million vehicles in China. They sold more in China than in the United States. All right, I'm going to kind of very briefly. So I think in the opening session, somebody asked, is India third world or first world? Okay, that was a good question, insightful question. And the response was yes, both, in different parts of the world, in different parts of business. All right, software development, information technology, they are clearly a worldwide leader. Okay. Software development India, Infosys, companies like Infosys, okay. And in Bangalore, India, they have built what I'll call the Silicon Valley of software, okay. It's the epicenter of the IT industry. Significant amount of companies just in that particular region alone. Some of these companies I'm sure you've all heard of: Infosys, Oracle, Wipro, Tata. these are major players in this particular environment and all based in India. All right. Why do we care? Why is that important for, Dell Computer or others to work with the folks in India? And it's an interesting, number one, kind of similar to the statement that we made earlier about Apple and hiring 8,700 in engineers. In India, there's a significant supply of engineering talent. 400,000 college graduates in engineering each year alone. Relatively speaking, on a global basis, relatively low labor costs, okay? The cost of an engineer in India is about half of that same comparable talent in the United States. Two key players, they are India is very fluent in English, but also culturally comfortable with working with Western companies. And time zone is a critical point. Effectively, a company can get 24-hour, 7 by 24, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day work. I can send things at the end of my day to India, and by the next morning, because it's their daytime, when I come back in the office, work's done. Okay. Companies like IBM and Microsoft and many others have set up operations in India. It's a significant opportunity for growth and a significant opportunity for very skilled, intelligent workforce. All right. So, what is globalization? We are, as I said, in a living classroom, a relatively interdependent economy, global economy. Somewhat integrated. We can't necessarily divorce ourselves of doing business in different parts of the world. It's the way it's going to be. Okay. There's a number of factors that drive that. Trade barriers are being reduced. In foreign direct investment in different countries and technology is improving. All right. We're being more culturally aware and cognizant of how to do business in different parts of the world. Oftentimes, I'm competing against the same companies in different parts of the world, so I know who they are. These companies here, look at these. I mean, all of these companies, IKEA, McDonald's, Starbucks, Coca-Cola, Apple, Sony, Citibank, all major players. You recognize these brands. Anywhere you go in the world, you're going to see this in whether you can truly understand everything, you can recognize the brand image. We talk about factors of production. All right. When we talk about the factors of production, what is that? It's the resources, it's labor, it's the energy requirements, it's the physical land or the capital investment that I need to make. These are my factors of production. Understand those points because they will be on a quiz later. And ultimately, each of these factors of production have unique differences based on different parts of the world. All right, the cost, the quality of them. All right. Some people believe that we are becoming somewhat homogenized. All right, that there's no such thing as a German product or a Japanese product or an American product, that we're becoming just global products. And to some degree, I tend to agree with that. I still, whenever I travel overseas or elsewhere, I'm always looking to find something that's relatively unique. And that, quite frankly, it's getting a little more harder and harder to do that. All right, because we are so global. Are all the products we have global? Well, maybe not. Yeah, McDonald's is still global, but they do have variations in terms of what they serve in India versus what they serve on the menu in China or Germany or United States. Okay. We're going to talk a lot this semester, a little later on, about um, trade agreements, tariffs, subsidies, all the barriers to trade that occur, financial and otherwise, tangible and intangible. All right, we're going to talk about foreign direct investment and how companies are getting footholds in different parts of the world as a result of that. And all of this leads to the expansion of globalization. And without doubt, transportation and telecommunication, two critical factors. Okay. I've managed teams all over the world, sales teams, engineering teams. Of course, and I'm part of the generation, I always want to be someplace. I want to know my top 10 customers, top tier customers, they knew me personally because I would get on an airplane, I would spend time with them, I would work with them directly, indirectly. Even though as general manager or vice president of the company, I didn't have to. I had other people who could, but I wanted them to see me and know me. I wanted them to have a conduit to me. Transportation and telecommunication certainly enabled and made my job easier in terms of maintaining those relationships. Initially in person, eventually through Skype for Business, WebEx, whatever it was. Okay, Zoom, you name it. Advances in telecommunications, transportation, improving and increasing the globalization of our society. We'll talk a fair amount this semester also about geopolitical, social, economic, legal environments of business and how they impact the decisions that we make. We'll talk and get very specific in terms of some of the elements of the regional trade agreements that exist, okay, and how they have evolved. The European Union and what are the impacts of Brexit on globalization and how business is conducted. And that's actually a topic that's playing out right now because many of the firms that have produced the vaccine for COVID, with Oxford and AstraZeneca, out of the UK, and now we got to get that across the borders. And when they were all part of the European Union, that was relatively seamless to do. But now with Brexit, it's a bit more challenging. Okay? The channel between UK and France, was shut down for a period, and logistics have become more challenging. Moving products across the borders now requires more documentation than ever before. So, at least in a very long time. So we have the same thing when we talk about the USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, US-China trade relations. Where are they today? So we'll get into a lot of this, but all of this is a key component to the globalization discussion that we're in. Global institutions, and we'll talk a lot more about each of these individually, but the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations, the G7, the G8, the G20. Each of these organizations are critical elements in terms of understanding how commerce occurs and what agreements we can follow, what agreements we don't have to follow, who's a party to it. When we're doing business in any part of the world, what can we use? How can each of these organizations help us or not? The World Trade Organization, it's really here to help lower the barriers of trade between different countries. Their focus in the world is to facilitate seamless trade. They have a major organization, and they have about 164 nations that are members of the WTO. They are I won't characterize them too simplistically by saying they're a one-stop source, but they do facilitate the agreements between multiple nations, multinational agreements among its member countries. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, they provide funding. Now, we'll talk a lot about that this semester because there are different schools of thought and whether or not it's good or not. You know, how accountable are countries that do obtain funding or companies that do obtain funding, and how accountable are they to meet the goals and the commitments they made? They are a lender, but in theory, they should be a lender of last resort. The World Bank. This is, for those developing countries, the source for economic development. Okay, they provide funding through the mechanisms of low interest loans to countries and who are in great need due to some, not necessarily unforeseen, but some key event that may have occurred, whether a natural disaster, whether a war or something like that. And as a result, their goal is to help improve economic development in those developing parts of the world.
I have a question.
Yes.
Where does the World Bank source the capital to make those loans?
A lot of cases they obtain funding from member nations who pay in. In other cases, they can generate funds through financial, interest rates and things like that. All right.
Got it. Thank you.
United Nations, okay, maintain peace. That's their goal. It's their focus. Develop a more cooperative relationship between countries. All right, 193 countries, that they work with now. They try to mediate disputes between countries, and in essence, improve and promote human rights. They want to make sure that their focus in life is to make sure that we can be as understanding and as respectful on a global basis as possible. Now, different groups here, G7, G8, G20, form their own alliances and allegiances and agreements. You can see the evolution of G7, G8, G20. And these groups, their finance ministers, their financial leadership work together to maintain common monetary and economic policy. This group, G20, is the vast majority of the gross domestic product across the world. Are trade and investment barriers declining? I mean, that's one question that we have, because in order to facilitate easy, somewhat seamless trade across countries, we have to have a reduction in the trade barriers. Trade is when two countries have a transaction and export goods and import goods from one to the other. Foreign direct investment occurs when one invests and actually builds in another country. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was intended, as one of the predecessors to the WTO, was intended to lower these barriers and to reduce the cost of transacting across borders. You can see how trade and investment barriers have declined over time. Okay, in some cases, in most cases, what was in the 1950s at 18% tariff rate now, 25% for Italy. Now you can see we're under 2, maximum 3% in some cases. Production's increasing throughout the world, at least through the main G20. This is the value of that trade has increased. These are charts that are in your textbook. You can peruse those as you read the chapter. Okay, we look at different comparisons of world trade, world production over time, and how it's improved and increased. Yes, we're becoming more of a consumption society. With that comes some challenges in terms of environment and other, but we are a consumption-based society. And as a result, you would expect the graphs to reflect this kind of increase over time. It's consistent in relatively, there's a kind of a direct relationship between the growth of population and the consumption. Communications clearly has played a significant role. You know, the development of semiconductors and microprocessors over time have improved, you know, the capabilities of certain technologies. Smartphones are, you know, they're computers in our pocket now. They're cameras in our pocket. And we've got, you know, access no matter where we are around the world. Whereas, you know, 20, 30, 40 years ago, they did not exist. Over time, you know, the advancement through what is called Moore's Law has helped improve our capabilities. All right. Moore's Law basically says as the power of a microprocessor doubles, the cost of production reduces by half. So double microprocessor power, the production, the cost of production is cut in half. It's done historically, Moore's Law said every 18 months. Now it's closer to 12 months, okay? The advancements that are taking place with semiconductor companies, whether it be Apple, Intel, AMD, TSMC, any number of semiconductor companies out there, the advancements are much faster now than every 18 months. The internet, clearly a factor in terms of globalization. No question, okay? Don't even need to say this to you. I mean, you know that. Where is the internet going? With the adoption of the Internet of Things, in other words, all devices connected to themselves, with the advancements of 5G, with the incorporation of artificial intelligence and 5G and the Internet of Things, we begin to get a society that is more interconnected, even more so than today. This enables e-commerce on a global basis to be more readily available, faster, quicker, more interconnected. Transportation, also a key factor. All right. All right, foreign direct investment. You know, the United States was the leader, has been the leader in investing in other countries, but it's becoming more equitable, okay, more on parity. China is investing in other countries. Germany's investing, Canada. The FDI, foreign direct investment, is not just exclusive to the United States. Okay, here's a chart from the textbook that shows this is figure 1.2 in your textbook. You know, some of the changes in FDI over time. Okay, look at the UK, France, Germany, United States. I mean, yeah, these are percentages, but and so it kind of skews the chart a little bit. The percentage growth, United States still certainly high, and if you were look at pure dollars, U.S. is still a leader, but UK, France, Germany, Japan, China, other parts of the world, all increasing their foreign direct investment, cross-border investment in order to enable commerce. One organization I encourage you to take a look at is OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperative Development. OECD is a key source of information such as this global economic data.
Quick question.
Mhm.
Since France, Germany, and the UK, I think at the point of this graph, they're all part of the European Union, and this is a percentage of their GDP. How is that? I feel like there's a little, it's like kind of weird comparing that to the United States, Japan, and China, right?
Yeah, like I said, if you were to change the scale here, this is just percentage of investment change year over year, or
Mhm.
decade over decade, if you would. But if we were to put pure dollars there, I mean, the scale would look a whole lot different.
And does this like include, let's say for Germany, like the kind of bailout payout to Greece a couple years ago?
That
No.
I don't. Yeah, I'm aware of what you're referring to, but I don't know if it's included in this chart or not.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, we'll get into that in terms of, are the countries such as Greece or Italy, are they living up to their commitments to be part of the European Union? And there's a lot of debate about that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Again, continue foreign direct inflow between where is it going? Developed or developing countries? I'm going to skip through a lot of things here because we're getting a little short on time, but you can kind of read through some of these now. The multinational enterprise, who are they? What are they growing? They're growing substantial. We know that. That's why we're taking this class. It's not just US anymore. Globalization. There's been a lot of debate about it. Okay? And, is it, some support it, some don't. Some have different perspectives of what that means. Okay. Brexit is one of the examples in terms of, pulling back a bit. I think ultimately we are so well interconnected that we have to be global. All right, with that, I think I'm going to kind of wrap it up for today. All of this is in here. You can get a chance to take a look at this. The latter part of here is there's some studies being done in terms of globalization, its impact on the environment, and so on. With that said, I will end it there for today. Anybody have any questions for me?
Will you be posting the slideshow to Canvas? I just didn't see it in there already.
Posting the slideshow?
Yes.
Yeah, so this presentation is already there. It's in Canvas files. Everything I presented today was posted to the Canvas files section last Monday. So this is already there, but I will post tonight or by tomorrow morning the recording of this session. Okay.
I was also wondering how much of the specific info on like Apple, Boeing, and GM will be on like quizzes.
Not. Okay.
Okay.
The quizzes I'm going to have are going to be more on the test material, and you'll hear me, say throughout, pay attention to that because it'll be on the quiz. You don't have to worry about Apple or Boeing or the companies I talk about. I do use those because I want you to see how they apply it. That to me is important, but the quizzes I'm going to be testing more just on the, the kind of multiple choice material.
Got it. Just want to make sure I wasn't taking notes on stuff that I didn't need to.
Yeah, and if anybody can't see this, or if you can't find this file, let me know because I posted always before the class.
Thank you.
Shannon, do you see it
Yeah.
there?
Yes, I just found it. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Have a good one.
You too.